All right, guys, here's Renaissance and Reformation, try and get ahead, part 2. We last left off talking about the effect of Johann Gutenberg's printing press and how that was an incredible game changer when it comes to the Renaissance and Reformation. The Reformation is going to be about reforming the church, the Protestant Reformation, which is about protesting things in the church that were just not quite correct, protesting the corruption. Now, we know going through the Middle Ages that the church maintained its power. It was the one constant because of the nastiness and brutality of the Middle Ages. Well, up and through the Renaissance here now, the Roman Catholic Church, still very powerful, begins to lose power for the very first time. Much of the upper levels of the church hierarchy had become wildly corrupt. And not only that, but their wealth, their excess was very visible. And the upper levels of the clergy were drawing the attention of the poor people who were suffering while they're living wealthy, extravagant lives. No longer was most of the religious clergy focused on the spiritual mission of getting people into heaven, but instead they were trying to get rich. And finally, a call for change comes about, which begins the Protestant Reformation. As I said, popes in Rome and high-ranking bishops are living just as wealthy, if not wealthier, than some of the kings of the area. And not only were they wealthy, but they wanted the power to dictate and control everything. Now, that being said, there were still some good, devoted clergy doing the right thing like they were supposed to do, but and some were good patrons of the arts, but overall, the corruption is beginning to command everybody's attention. And one of the ways that the clergy become so wealthy is they begin to acquire things known as indulgences. Like, when you indulge in something you really enjoy. Well, an indulgence allows a person to literally pay for their sins to be forgiven. Think of it as like a debit card for sinning. Instead of going to confession and confessing your sins, right, or giving an honest monetary donation to the church, you could prepay, like a prepaid phone card. Here, can I put 25 bucks on here, and that gives me 25 sins. All right, it's the way you could sin and not have to worry about it. Now, many people don't like this. This is not church doctrine. It's very secular, and it's these abuses that leads to the church's, downfall from power. And centering around it is this handsome gentleman here named Martin Luther. Luther unintentionally launches a revolt amongst the church. He is a monk. He is a Catholic monk. And he becomes very upset at the corruption. When he saw these indulgences being sold in his hometown, it is literally, I always say, the straw that broke the camel's back. He's like, seriously? How can you do this? Not only could you prepay for your sins, but church officials were collecting money. If you pay me, I will say forgiveness prayers for your dead ancestors so they can get out of purgatory. Purgatory is like a waiting room to get into heaven. You know you're going to make it, but you may be in this in-between realm for who knows how long. But this could fast pass you in the Disney world right into heaven. Something that just doesn't work. Now, as was customary, Martin Luther doesn't like this, and he goes down and he mails his grievances, his theses, to the front door of the local cathedral. Martin Luther's 95 Theses. This is what you did. He followed procedure. He followed protocol. But when people see them, coupled with Gutenberg's printing press, his ideas begin to spread. Printers quickly Xerox photocopy Martin Luther's 95 Theses and spread them throughout the area. Many church officials try to force Martin Luther to retract his word. Instead, he actually urges others, I need Henry to speak out. I need Lucas to speak out. I need Will to speak out. I need, Eliana to speak out. I need people to speak out, to get behind this. And so when the church tries to stamp it out, it clearly has the opposite effect. It spurns more conversation. So as a result, poor Martin Luther gets excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church, and he's declared a criminal by King Charles V, the Emperor of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor. But what Martin Luther has done touches on something that resonates with the people, right? They understand it. And the idea was that salvation could be achieved through faith in God alone, and that the Bible becomes the sole source of religious truth. Luther also went on to say that church officials don't have special powers, meaning that popes and bishops were just men. They're just sinners like the rest of us. They are no better or no worse. And he calls for a cleaning up, a cleansing of the hypocrisy and worldliness of the church. Now, this will all result in what's known as the Peace of Augsburg, Augsburg, where as Luther goes on this quest, he creates instability in the Holy Roman Empire, mostly the modern-day country of Germany, where there were 360 different states, 360 different princes. And they were always seeking a way to gain more power for themselves and to, needle away and chip away at the power of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. They also don't want to pay some of the taxes and money that they owed to the church, so that way they could keep more for themselves. And so these commoners in Germany also began to riot. They wanted a change in the lifestyle of church officials. So the princes say, hey, I'm going to back my people with this. I'm going to side with them and make myself look even better. So the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V will invite several of these princes to come and meet with him. Right? They're going to talk about peace and quelling the violence of the realm. Now, many German princes had already began to study this new religion known as Lutheranism, a Protestant religion named after Martin Luther. In 1555, the Holy Roman Emperor and the German princes signed the Peace of Augsburg, allowing each individual German prince to pick his own religion, whether you're going to be Catholic or whether you're going to be Lutheran Protestant. And Martin Luther's efforts are going to spill over. There's another guy named John Calvin. And Calvin was a monk who was going to build upon Luther's foundation. And Calvin was a strict adherent to the Bible is the sole source of truth. God is this all-powerful, all-knowing being. And he understands that man is a sinful, weak creature by nature. And so John Calvin here, this gentleman here, pioneers the belief in Christian predestination, which says that God has already decided who and who is not going to make it into heaven, even before you're born. So to help sway his mind, God's mind, Calvin builds small communities in and around Geneva, Switzerland. And they follow the old, strict adherence to the Benedictine code of order, a time to work, a time to study, a time to pray, hoping that the hard work, the discipline, and the honesty in focusing on religion would help make sure you get into heaven. And this applies to both men and women. And so what Calvin was doing begins to attract attention. And people try to transplant what Calvin did in other communities all over Europe. And one effect that it has, it begins to start religious battles, right? Battles between Catholics and Protestants. The Roman Catholic Church will try and reassert itself, and the most violent battles will happen between England and France, focusing on a group of people known as Huguenots or French Protestants. So we're going to have a lot of religious wars going on in Europe at this time. And this brings us to jolly old England and good old King Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII of England leads a different type of religious separation. It's more of a political ideal. Henry VIII, to this point, English king, had been a good Catholic ruler. He had actually been rewarded for the Pope by resisting Lutheranism. And problem is, Henry VIII wants to annul his marriage to a lady named Catherine of Aragon, who was his brother's widow, and she hadn't produced a male heir. So Henry VIII blames it on her. Now, the problem with this is the Pope says no, because he says, King Henry, you are a role model to the people. I see no reason why your marriage should be annulled, which means it's as if it never took place. In addition, the Pope's best friend was Holy Roman Emperor, very powerful Emperor Charles V, who was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So Henry says, no, I'm going to take a stand here, and I'm going to break with the church. To that end, I will create my own church, the Church of England. So Henry VIII will simply pass laws declaring him to be the head of the Church of England. He then has a loyal archbishop annul the marriage to Catherine, and Henry is free to get married again. Henry will close all monasteries and convents, and he will go so far as to seize Catholic Church land and money, making him an enemy of the Pope. But he takes that land and money and gives it to powerful, influential friends who would back him up and support him in this new English Anglican church. Now, if you go up on here to Weaver Dairy Road and go to St. Benedict's Anglican Church, and you go down to St. Thomas More, and you go to the church service, will you be able to tell the difference? The answer is no. It's a political thing. Who is head of the church? The English monarch, to the Anglicans, and to Catholics, the Pope. So, this split will continue more fighting in and around the Revolution. So, after seeing things fracture in Germany, causing problems in England and now in France, the new Pope, Paul III, begins to make the decision to end this Reformation. He is going to steer the church back on track. And it's going to get to its original mission, saving souls, working for God and for the people. And he pushes back the Protestant movement. He begins to clean up the church, including a stricter, more efficient, frugal papacy. He gets rid of corrupt officials, and he forms what is known as the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent meets for over a period of 20 years, figuring out how to reestablish the Roman Catholic Church as a dominant figure, how to reestablish church doctrine, and how to go about it. And harsh punishments will be instituted for any church official who was corrupt. And while the Council of Trent sounds like a good idea, it's going to wind up leading to more problems later on. One of these will be the famous Spanish Inquisition. I got to speed up a little bit here. As a result of the Council of Trent, a church court was established, and its purpose was to find non-believers and other heretics who did not believe in God. They also searched and hunted for Protestants, the way Romans used to search for Christians under every log and rock in the forest. And they destroyed any book that questioned Catholic doctrine. And a new order of monks is going to be called to go out and spread this doctrine, known as Jesuits. They were named for a former knight named Ignatius of Loyola. And he was determined to spread Catholicism. And he reaches down into his military training. And he's going to train his monks to be missionaries, kind of like a soldier, a strict moral code, religious discipline, things military guys need. And the idea of the Jesuits was to send missionaries to all parts of the globe to spread the word. And this comes right on the heels of European exploration. The Jesuits do not stay in Europe, but instead they travel to Protestant-held territories across the world, or places to beat the Protestants to the punch in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia. Now in Europe, Catholics and Protestants are competing for spiritual dominance. And this once again will flare up into violence. This frenzy for reform kicks the problem of who started this. Someone's got to be responsible. And there's witch hunts. And this is the time where people are drowned or burned at the stake for being a witch or a warlock. Now normally these were the kind of people on the edges of society, kind of the outsiders, maybe the introverts. They are punished for this. And living in Italy are a large number of Jews who for many years had lived in harmony with everybody else, being educated, doing professional jobs that everybody needs. However, in Spain, the Hebrews are going to be a focal point of the problem. With the growing religious passion and fervor, many Hebrews were asked to convert to Christianity. And if they did not, then they were going to be put in an isolated area of the city that would eventually become known as the Jewish ghettos, that you will see more prominently if you're in Miss Jones' class studying the Holocaust. Well, Spain will eventually expel its Jewish population just as Columbus is setting sail in 1492. Now, many of these Jews were artisans and merchants, again, doing important professional jobs that everybody needed, and as a result, they had money, they were wealthy, they were successful. Germany will follow suit and expel their Jews, who move further eastward into places like Poland and areas to live outside the Holy Roman Empire to avoid this persecution. So that is the religious side of the Reformation, and now it's going to bleed over into science. Scientific achievement. We have this during the Reformation, this creativity and advancement mainly in the area of science. And as the church began to lose and collapse in its power, this idea of humanism begins to take effect. Well, the church's stranglehold on education and educational policy also weakens. People wanted to learn. They wanted to be educated. They wanted to know your favorite word stuff. They wanted to examine the physical world and everything in it, like the Greek philosophers of old. And the church could no longer impose its own thoughts. They could not stifle creativity that scientists were working hard to expand. Guys like Kepler and Galileo and Newton we're about to talk about. So the first guy up is Nicholas Copernicus. And he restates the heliocentric theory of the universe. Copernicus said that the Earth and the other planets revolve around the sun. The sun does not revolve around the Earth. Now, this was something that the church believed. Copernicus's revelations and theories upset the church. His findings were opposite as to what they were telling everybody. So if Copernicus proved the church was wrong about this, it could lead to a bunch of unwanted questions. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So they make him, pretty much stand up and say that he was wrong, but he was not. Building off of him is Tycho Brahe, follows Copernicus. Copernicus will build an observatory, and he will actually build a telescope. And as he does so, he's able to chart the heavens, the movements of the stars and the constellations and the planets. And after a period of years, he proves that Copernicus was absolutely correct. And this brings us to Kepler and Galileo. Johann Kepler is inspired by Copernicus and Brahe, and he and a fellow scientist, Galileo Galilei, chart and they make more powerful telescopes. They're able to see more planets and more moons, and they chart their orbits. And they say as the planets revolve around the sun, not only do they revolve around the sun, but they rotate as they're doing it. So it's two rotations, and that the Earth will do a complete cycle every 24 hours. Now, like Copernicus, Galileo was persecuted and condemned by the church, albeit more famously. During the Inquisition, he is brought in by a religious tribunal or panel that makes him publicly state that he was incorrect. But in a famous bit of history, as he is leaving, he says, yes, it really does move. Galileo was 100% correct, and this is on his tomb in the city of Florence today. All right, so next we're going to get to Isaac Newton's the philosophy of the Principia Mathematica. Really smart guy here. While studying at the university in Cambridge, England, pondering super deep scientific thoughts, when an apple from a tree supposedly lands on Isaac Newton's head. This incident will inspire Newton. Kevin and Leo and the guys are going to love this, are going to use math to prove his theory of gravity. It is a mathematical formula. And Newton showed with math, which doesn't lie, that planets do move, and that it is mathematical principles, not natural philosophy, that governs the laws of gravity and holds things in place. Newton will show that all motion could be studied and measured with mathematics. So, this will lead to one of my favorite foods, and a great name, Francis Bacon. You guys use him in your biology, in your chemistry classes. All right. The great philosopher Aristotle was wrong, somewhat, in his thoughts about governments of the physical world. He said that the answer to questions could only be arrived at by following a long, intensive period of study. Well, Francis Bacon says, it doesn't need to be all that long. And he creates the famous scientific method, where the 5-step scientific method, where you form a hypothesis, you run you do your background research, you have your question, you, run an experiment, you record your thoughts and your findings, what worked, what didn't, your observations. You run the experiment again, and if you reach the same conclusion over and over again, you are probably correct. If not, you keep doing it until the answer is found. And the last guy is René Descartes. All right, talk about him a little bit later on. And Descartes emphasized the ability of humanity. It is humans' ability to reason, like Michelangelo's statue of the David, that is, problem solving is one of the foundations and the basic truths of learning. René believed that by looking and studying a problem and finding different ways to tackle, the old saying, there's more than one way to skin a cat. All right? There is multiple solutions to every problem, like maybe doing a Rubik's Cube. And he gives his greatest quote, I think, which is what I want you guys to do, therefore I am. And so as Western Europe begins to break out of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it goes through this long and beautiful period of thought and creativity and artistic achievement during the Renaissance. As a return to the study of academics and learning and education leads to the Renaissance artists. It leads to the questioning of the power of the church, forming new thoughts on religion. It helps clean up the corrupt structure of the church. And scientists like Isaac Newton and Galileo and Descartes and Bacon lead the charge with human progress and new approaches to scientific ideas and learning. And Gutenberg's printing press allows them to be shared. Martin Luther is bold enough to propose the Protestant Reformation. And as Europe is beginning to break out of its isolation and explore the greater world around it, the Renaissance are one of the great impetuses, or the great impetus that will be a game changer, will revolutionize the world like few things before it have done. All right, guys, that's the end of the Reformation and Renaissance unit. We will continue with transatlantic trade and absolutism next week.